We have an outstanding speaker today for you, Mr. Dan Moore, CEO of Rockefeller Group. It's also an exciting day because this afternoon, it's the Fall Fair Kickoff, starting back here at 2 o'clock. So some amazing speakers, Donald Sheets from Ohio State, Mike O'Malley from Notre Dame. Then we have Mark Gibson, CEO of Capital Markets of JLL, and Ward Fitzgerald. So it's going to be an exciting afternoon between 2 and 4:30 back here, followed by a reception that all students, alumni, parents, and friends are invited to. So it's my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker for the Football Friday and the Real Estate Colloquium class. He's Mr. Dan Moore, class of 1994, University of Notre Dame. He serves as president and CEO of Rockefeller Group, a position he's held in New York City since 2018. He's a member of their board of directors and executive committee, as well as the company's investment and portfolio committee. He joined the company in 2016 as executive vice president and head of urban development. Prior to Rockefeller, Dan Moore worked for 16 years with Hines, another outstanding firm. Hines interests in New York, Connecticut, and Washington, D.C. During his tenure at Hines, his responsibilities included office and residential development, capital markets, investment management, marketing, and leasing. Mr. Moore earned an MBA from the Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania with a dual major in finance and real estate, and he earned his bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the University of Notre Dame. In addition, prior to attending graduate school, he served as a captain in the U.S. Air Force. So Dan, thank you for your service, and thanks for being with us today to talk about how can real estate development be a force for good. I give you Dan Moore.
Thanks, Sam. Appreciate it. Great. Dan, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. This is it's a real treat for me to be here as part of the class. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the guests that have showed up that might be here for the football game and some of the other events that are happening today. Thanks for taking a little bit of time out to join us to talk about a subject that matters a lot to me, and I think dovetails in with a lot of what this place is about. Which is how can real estate development be a force for good? So before we jump into it, and we'll make this as interactive as you want, so feel free to jump in with questions at any point. We'll have some time for questions at the end as well. I just wanted to ask a question, and if anybody wants to volunteer, please do, or else I'm going to have to call on folks. When you were a little kid, 4 years old, 5 years old, sort of late preschool, kindergarten, when you were a little kid, what did you want to be when you grew up? Anybody volunteer? Front row, you got stuck. What did you want to be when you were a little kid? What do you want to be when you?
When I was young, playing sports, probably an athlete.
Professional athlete, like a professional
Baseball player.
baseball player. That's great. Thank you for that. Anybody over here? Somebody shout something out. What did you want to be when you grew up? Yeah. Astronaut. That's pretty cool. But I need one more from this side, all the way over there. Give me one. Somebody. Yes. A lawyer, because your dad's one, right? So you saw it. So that's great. They're a professional athlete, astronaut, lawyer. So when I was a little kid, when I was about 4 or 5 years old, what I wanted to be when I grew up was a dinosaur. Because I don't care if you're 5 or 25 or 55 or 105, dinosaurs are awesome. And that's what I wanted to be. But what I didn't want to be, and what I didn't hear anybody in the audience today say they wanted to be, was a real estate developer. And there's some reasons for that. One is it's not really the most accessible career field. It's not like, your dad was a lawyer, right? So you knew about that. You knew the work that he did each day and we were exposed to it. Or like an athlete that you might see on TV, understanding what they do, or even an astronaut, which you sort of would see on TV or even in the movies. And so it's not the kind of thing that you would typically get exposed to as a young kid, unless maybe it's through media, like a movie or a film or a book. And even in that case, almost uniformly, and the reading for this week talked about this, almost uniformly, the real estate developer is the bad guy. The real estate developer is the antagonist. The real estate developer is often the actor at the very beginning of the story that puts the whole plot into motion because they're doing something that has to be stopped, that's viewed as being against the community or against the protagonist. And so examples of this really abound kind of everywhere. And the reading talked particularly about a few movies, one of which has a great connection here at Notre Dame, right? The Goonies. It's a little bit hard to see on the screen. I apologize for that. But everybody know the Goonies actually has a real big Notre Dame connection. Does anybody know why? What the overlap is? It's sort of a 6 degrees of separation. So There, yeah, Rudy. Who got it? Oh, okay, Dan got it. All right. So demographically, Dan's going to get that. He's going to lock in on that. So Sean Astin, there's a bunch of kids in this movie that end up having really good careers, but Sean Astin, who ultimately played Rudy, which was filmed here at Notre Dame about 30 years ago, was the leader of the Goonies. And the reading talked about this. Does anybody remember from the reading or from the movie, how does the whole plot set in motion? Why did the Goonies even go in search of the treasure? It was in the reading. I'll give you a hint. All right. So the house is going to be foreclosed on. Yeah, very, very close. So basically there was a developer who wanted to build a golf course, and so he was going to foreclose on all these houses to build a golf course. They wanted to stop him, so they went to go search for the treasure. I think the reading also referred to Up, and folks might remember it's a great movie, right? Up, Disney. Fantastic movie. The first 10 minutes absolutely break your heart because it's a whole thing about Mr. Gunderson and his wife. I mean, literally, if you're not in tears at the end of those 10 minutes, it's a tough moment. But right after that, you fast forward to the movie and the big story and the iconic image of the house floating away with the balloons, right? Like that perfect image and this beautiful image. But it's all set in motion by something else. And if you take a look at the screen, you'll remember what was set that one in motion. So there it is, Mr. Gunderson's house before he takes off, right in the middle of a construction site. And if you remember, there's the foreman who's trying to get him to sell his house. There's the guys in suits on the cell phones over to the side who are clearly put in a bad light. And again, it's real estate development that's viewed as the antagonist here that basically sets the whole plot in motion. And even the VeggieTales, right? The VeggieTales, which is one of the most gentle, kind pieces of media out there, right? Every episode ends with God made you special and he loves you very much. Even the VeggieTales are not crazy about real estate developers. Because in Celery Night Fever, which I'm sure you all have watched once or twice, the band, they got to get the band back together. Larry the Cucumber, Bob the Tomato got to get the band back together to save Celery Park because there's a developer who wants to turn it into a parking lot. He wants to pave Celery Park and put up a parking lot. And that developer is played by an onion. Stinky, smelly, make you cry onion. Even the VeggieTales think real estate developers are maybe not the greatest folks on the planet. And so with that kind of a background, not wanting to be a real estate developer when I grew up, and in the kind of media community that we all grew up in, where real estate development in general is put in a pretty negative light, how does somebody end up there? How do you end up doing this as a career? And certainly as I mentioned, I never really wanted to be a real estate developer. In fact, I came to Notre Dame, and I had a real interest in buildings. I had a real interest in architecture and structures, and as Professor Kelly said, studied structural engineering here. And just as your undergraduate experience doesn't really help you, for example, on the engineering side, it doesn't really make you an engineer, but it teaches you how to think like an engineer. I think a lot of your undergraduate experience doesn't necessarily turn you into what you're going to do, right, or that thing you wanted to be when you grew up, but it helps you, not the thing you're going to do, figure out the thing you're going to do, but really the person that you want to be. That's a lot of what the 4 years here as an undergraduate are about. And that idea of Notre Dame informing who I wanted to be can be really summed up with some words that Father Malloy, Monk Malloy, shared at our graduation in 1994. And he said, as you leave this place, as you leave Notre Dame, and unfortunately I hate to tell you, you're going to have to leave at some point. But when you do leave this place, there's really only two causes that are worth the time and the gifts that you've been given to serve in your professional life and in your personal life. That's the cause of justice and human well-being. It's that simple. And it was that really sort of stamped, I think, on all of us, and I think is a really good connection to the original founding principles of Notre Dame of being a force for good in the world, that as you leave here and you're sent out into the world to serve the causes of justice and human well-being. And so that was who I wanted to be. Dan mentioned I was in the Air Force for 4 years. I was actually in ROTC while I was here at Notre Dame. So I left here wanting to be serving those causes of justice and human well-being. Being in the military, serving the country through that was a really great way to do that for me. But after being in the Air Force for 4 years and having a really great experience there and getting to do some amazing things both in the United States as well as I got to go to the Middle East a couple of times, I knew that there was a different path for me. I wanted to do something else. And I wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do. Still didn't want to be a real estate developer at that point. Still didn't know what it was. And ultimately didn't get exposed to real estate development, but for a piece of advice that I got from a member of the Notre Dame community, a member of the Notre Dame family. And this would have been when I was about 25 or so years old. a friend of mine, a classmate of mine who lived nearby, his father took us all out for dinner because we were all pretty early in our careers, and he would take us out to dinner and check in, and it was always nice to go out with friends, and it was really nice to go out when somebody's parent treated you, because none of us, we were all pretty early in our careers. And he would always check in with us and ask us what we were up to and what we were thinking about, and he talked to me and he said, Dan, what's going on with you? What are you thinking about? And I said, well, I'm pretty sure I'm going to get out of the Air Force, and I'm really thinking about going to graduate school. He said, okay, well, tell me more about that. I said, well, I love buildings, I love construction, I love engineering, I love sort of that whole process, so I think I want to go get a construction management degree. And he said, I get it and I understand it and I think that's a great idea, but did you ever consider something broader? Did you ever consider going and getting your MBA? Because you might, through a little bit broader course of study, you had a very technical undergraduate degree, but maybe go do something a little broader course of study, be exposed to something that you like just as much, maybe be exposed to something you like even more, maybe be exposed to something you don't even know about that could really interest you. You can always go and do the construction management after that, but maybe it's worth considering. Really, really great piece of advice that I was lucky enough to pay attention to and was fortunate enough to be able to take advantage of. And as Professor Kelly said, I ended up going to Wharton for business school, and it was there that I first got exposed to real estate development as a thing that you can do, as like a career that you can be in, as a business that exists outside of the sort of simplistic, cartoonish Hollywood way that it's often portrayed. And it really came from going to a company presentation with a company called Hines, which is based down in Houston, Texas. It's a global real estate developer and investment manager. And I went to the presentation. It was my first semester of business school. And I listened to what they did for a living and how they worked on these great projects and how they would start at the very beginning in the underwriting of the projects and the conceptualization of the project, working with designers and engineers and others, building it, leasing it, selling it. And it was really this kind of amazing total process where you got to do some of the things that I really like to do and even more. And so I left that presentation and I was kind of smitten with it. I said, this is really fantastic. So much so that I went home that night and I sat down and I spoke to my fiance, who's my wife Wendy now. We've been married for almost 25 years. And we were engaged at that time, and I said, Wend, I didn't even know this was like a thing you could do before I got here, and now it's 100% the thing I want to do when I walk out of here in another year and a half. And so I got laser focused on real estate development. I actually got really laser focused on Hines because I was really impressed with what they did and was lucky enough to be hired there. And worked there for 16 years before joining Rockefeller Group and eventually taking on the role that I've got now, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And so it was really through that graduate school program that I figured out what it is that I wanted to do, right? I knew I wanted to be in real estate development, and I knew I wanted to be in the kind of top of the market, Class A, high-rise, commercial real estate development. But it was also trying to balance that out with what I talked about when I walked out of here from Notre Dame with, well, who do I want to be? And what's the best use of my time and talent? And the idea of taking commercial real estate, which has a bad reputation, sometimes deservedly so. It's a pretty tough business. It can be a difficult business. It's got some characters in it. I think we all know a few. And that bad reputation, how do I balance that with this idea of being a force for good, serving justice, serving human well-being? And thinking about in the context of, is there any way to reconcile those two things? Or is it, well, maybe I'll just be a good human being outside of the four corners of my work life, which is not a really great place to be, right? So I was really hoping there's a way to look at this in a new way and solve what might at first glance look like a paradox, but I would suggest is actually not. And so this has been on my mind really since I've been in the business, and now that I'm in the position that I'm in with Rockefeller Group, I get to think about these things and how it might inform our company and how our company can achieve some of these things. And so 3 or 4 years ago, we recast our mission, vision, and guiding principles. And this has been so important to me as far as sort of personally and professionally, but also for the guidance and overall strategic vision for our company that we bake this in to our guiding principles. So if you go to the Rockefeller Group website and you look up the situation about who we are, and you'll see our mission and our vision, this is our vision statement, and it's a direct callback to Father Malloy. To enhance human well-being through our passion for real estate and the built environment. This is the why we do what we do. The what we do is impacted in our mission statement, and we talk about that we build extraordinary properties, and we create exceptional experiences, and we create value for our partners and employees and communities. So that's the what, but this is the why. This is the root why it is we do what we do. And so these things, I think, often these big mission and vision statements, which is really fun, as the CEO and the president of the company to get to work on and think about these big picture issues and how you can tie in these really important questions together. Often these can get criticized for being somewhat unrealistic, somewhat pie in the sky. It's great that the CEO wants to put this kind of big target out there for us, but it's a lot harder to do, right? It's easy to say these are the things you want to do, but how do you actually put it into practice? And I would suggest, given that it's such a tough business, real estate, it needs an equally tough solution. But that tough solution is encompassed in something that we talk about a lot at Notre Dame, and certainly talk a lot about on Sundays. Don't often talk a lot about Monday through Friday, certainly not in real estate development, and that word is love. Let's talk about love for a second, because I want to be real clear what I mean when I talk about that. Because when we talk about love, we talk about it in a whole host of contexts, right? Like I can talk about how much I love my wife and how much I love my family. I can talk about, my son who's a student here, how much he loves his brothers in the dorm and how much he loves his friends. It's a great group of people. You can also talk about, how much you love the Taylor Swift concert that you went to, or how much you love your favorite food when you go home. All the same word, all very different things, but all really kind of passive if you think about them. Those words, if we go to the Greek language had a bunch of different words for love. When we talk about those words, they're a little more fine-tuned in their description of it. So that idea of that romantic love, that kind of love you have for your spouse, or your girlfriend, or your boyfriend, or your significant other, that would be eros, right? That's that romantic love. That's that crazy love. That's that thing that like hits you and it's awesome, right? But you're not causing it, right? It just happens. Like you see somebody and you love them and you don't know what to do about it. That love you have for your friends, that love you have for your sisters in the dorm, your brothers in the dorm, that's philia, right? That's that brotherly love. That's that sisterly love. The kind of love I'm talking about, the love that you got to bring to a tough business, is what the Greeks would have called agape. And agape, unlike eros, unlike philia, which are feelings, they're really things that happen to you. Agape is something that you choose to do. It's actually an act of will. Thomas Aquinas described agape very specifically as to will the good of another. So it's not a feeling, right? It's a decision. It's an act of will to actively advocate and work for the good of another. You sometimes hear agape described as fierce advocacy for the other. And sometimes around our company, a lot of times we'll put it into contrast is when you're operating from sort of a mindset of agape love, you're thinking less about what you want from someone and more about what you want for someone. It's another way to sort of think about it. It's not a feeling. It's a willful act. It's a decision. It's an intentional thing that you come to your daily life and work with. It's strong. It's muscular. It's a tough love. But like I said before, real estate's a tough business. So maybe agape is part of the solution. And I believe this so much that as part of this process that we went through in recasting our mission and vision, we also recast 5 guiding principles for Rockefeller Group. And they're on the board right here. It may be a little bit difficult to read, so I'll read the first one. I'll let you look at the others. But the first one starts off with love, a love for people and a love for the city. This underpins our business and guides our vision of improving people's lives in cities where they live and work. We work hard at work worth doing. A love for people and a love for the city, and that's agape love, right? We might feel good about people. We might feel good about the cities. But I think, we all know people. They're not always easy to love all the time. Sometimes you got to make a decision to love somebody. And we view that our work and our daily business in real estate, whether we're building things or we're operating things, creating places for people to work, places for people to live, that we can show our love for people, our fierce advocacy for others through the work that we do, as well as our love for the city. So again, not unlike the vision statement, these are easy things to say. The words are kind of easy, right? But as we all know, that Sunday sermon, when you're in the pew, right, I'm going out, I'm doing it. Like, I can show my love. I'll do it tomorrow. The first time you get a chance, we often fail more times than we succeed. So how do you take this vision? How do you take these guiding principles and really put them into action? So let me pause for a second. I'll tell you a little bit more about the company that I work for, Rockefeller Group, and I'll tell you how we put it into action. So Rockefeller Group, we're based in Manhattan. We're based in Midtown Manhattan. We're about a 100-year-old company. We were originally founded to develop Rockefeller Center. For anybody that might have been to Midtown Manhattan and been to Rockefeller Center, that's where we sort of trace back our legacy to, which is pretty awesome. It's a pretty awesome legacy to have. Today, 100 years later, We have two primary businesses where we own about 7 million square feet of Class A office in Midtown Manhattan. We call that our core portfolio. That's a portfolio of assets we intend to own long term. We have it as a generational timescale ownership, and it's really about generating ongoing cash flow each year. The second main sleeve of our business is real estate development, which is really why I joined the company, was to help grow that real estate development business. And we do what's called a merchant build development business. And in merchant build real estate development, you are going in, you're conceptualizing a project, designing it, building it, leasing it, maybe selling it, and then selling the lease, basically creating the cash flow stream if it's a rental project, and then selling it. We're not building it to hold and own that income long term. We're building it to create an income stream and then sell that income stream. We then take the proceeds, make the profit, rinse and repeat, put the capital to work again in a new project. And that merchant build business has grown quite a lot in the last 4 or 5 years. At the end of 2019, our pipeline of projects for Rockefeller Group on our development business was about $1.5 billion total project cost. And today we're nearly 4 times that. We're about $7.2 billion of real estate development projects around the country. So it's this massive growth. It's like the business we're in. So we're really, really into it. We do this across the country. We've got 7 regional offices from California through Colorado, Texas, and the East Coast, as well as the Southeast. And we work in primarily 3 product types: office, residential, and industrial. So let me tell you a little bit about how we bring our agape to those. So we talk about the office space, right? We've all seen big office buildings, right? And when you think about it, even in the post-COVID world, people spend a tremendous amount of time at the office, sometimes 40 hours a week, sometimes 60 if you're in investment banking, sometimes 80 hours a week. A lot of times you'll spend more time in your office than you do at home or with the people that you love the most. And through our work in the office space, either through projects that we create or some of the assets that we operate on a daily basis, we can make those places to come to really great, and places where people can do their best work, places where businesses can thrive, or we can make them, kind of drudgery and awful. And we seek to create places where businesses can create revolutions, can create innovation, can be successful. Because ultimately, when you look at what we do in the office space, we're an input to their business, whether you're a bank or a law firm, consulting firm. Ultimately, the real estate is an input, so we're a partner in their business. And we want to be a great partner in their business because ultimately their success becomes our success. And if we create the environment for them to be successful, we're going to be successful as well. And there's been a little bit of debate, and current debate, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A if anybody wants to, around the purpose of the office post-COVID. And I think as we get further and further away from that really hard part of the pandemic, we're once again discovering the real value of it. And Malcolm Gladwell, if you know the author Malcolm Gladwell, he talked about this a little in a recent book of his, and that came out in the last few years, about the bomber mafia, which is about the Air Force in World War II. But he talks about how revolutions happen. And he uses the term revolutions, but he doesn't mean political revolutions. It's really revolutions in thinking, which you could think of as innovation or creative destruction. And what he wrote about was revolutions, I'm quoting him now, revolutions are invariably group activities birthed in conversation, argument, validation, proximity, and the look in your listener's eye that tells you you're onto something, right? We've all had those moments, right? You're talking with your friends, you're talking with your classmates, you're working on a project with somebody, and you hit on something and somebody's eyes light up. It doesn't happen over Zoom. It doesn't happen over a conference call. That proximity, that being in the room together, that energy that comes when you're in the room together is a real thing. And the office space is where we can help create that through our work so that businesses can thrive, they can create revolutions, they can create innovation. And ultimately, we want to create a place where companies can grow, people can do the work that's going to give them success, they can be the people they want to be, they can do the things they want to do, and ultimately create the culture and the brand that's going to take them into the next phase of their lives and their careers. So that's on the office space. The residential side. When we talk about residential, at Rockefeller Group, we develop both for-rent apartments. We do small-scale wood frame stuff, 2 or 3 floor walk-up stuff. We also do high-rise, dense, urban, multifamily, multi-story. We also do condominium development, where instead of renting it, you actually sell the apartments instead of renting them out each year. And that's the real estate terminology for what we do. And we talk about asset classes, right? We talk about condos and we talk about apartments. But if you zoom back, in the multifamily space, what we're building, what we're creating, what we're developing are homes. We're creating homes for people. And for rental products, maybe you'll live there 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. For condominium project, you might live there a decade or more. And with the scale and the scope of what we do, we never forget we're building homes for people, that it's ultimately the people that are going to live there each and every day. And I always get excited whenever we have groundbreakings for new residential projects. We just had one in Atlanta. It'll be the 4th largest tower in Atlanta when it's done. And when I think about, when we're looking at the hole in the ground and we're putting the foundations in, and you think about all of the people that are going to live in this place and all of the stories that are going to be written. People are going to come there. It might be their first apartment. It might be the place they move after they just got married. It might be the place where they fall in love. It's going to be the place where maybe they fall out of love. Maybe it's the place where they come home late. Maybe it's the place where they woke up hungover. But ultimately, it's going to be a place where they write the stories of their lives, either a chapter or a long piece of that story. And that's an incredible responsibility, and it's an awesome responsibility, and it's just this amazing opportunity that we have through our work in real estate development to create homes, create communities, and really be an impact in people's lives. The third product type that I mentioned is the industrial product type. That's a little bit different. I would say on office and residential, it's a little bit more obvious. It's maybe a little more self-evident how you can show love for people, how you can show agape for people, because ultimately you're creating places where people are going every day. It's fundamentally organized around the needs of the people that walk in and out of the doors each day. For industrial, and when I talk about industrial, for those that may not have less familiarity, we're talking about something they're called logistics space or light manufacturing space. They're by and large very big concrete boxes, maybe 1 or 2 stories at the most. 2 stories is kind of rare, but very big tilt-up concrete boxes, not architecturally distinctive in most ways, and really organized primarily around the idea of the efficient movement and distribution of goods, right? It's all about how do companies like Amazon or third-party logistics companies get things from point A to point B as efficiently and as effectively as possible. So how can we show that love for people in the industrial space? Well, I thought here I'd show an actually specific example and tell you a little bit about that. This is a project in Edison, New Jersey. Anybody from New Jersey? Got some Jersey folks, okay. It's always the joke, like what exit, right? That's all I'm not going to say. But this is exit 10 in 10A off the New Jersey Turnpike. This was an old ExxonMobil synthetics plant. This is what it looked like about 7 years ago, a little bit before we bought it. It operated for about 70 years. And as you might imagine, over those 70 years, it was a research and production facility. It did some really intense petrochemical research and production. You see some of the things on there, petrochemicals, lubricants. And you might imagine with the evolution of environmental law, 70 years ago, environmental law and environmental regulations weren't what they were. And so the site was really pretty dirty. In fact, it had well over 200 what are known as areas of concern or areas of environmental concern. So 225, I think was the exact number, identified environmental problems on this site. Never mind that this is what it looked like, right? I mean, this is a pretty scary site. As a real estate developer, you know, the perfect site is level, square, efficient, clean. This is anything but. But we saw an opportunity here. We purchased the site in 2017, and if you were to go to exit 10A and go to Edison, this is what you'd see today. It's a 1 million square foot distribution center. It happened to be leased out to Amazon. And over the course of our development, the 3 years between the original acquisition of the site and the disposition of the site in 2020, disposition of the project, I should say, in 2020, we spent over $7 million on environmental remediation, some of those 225 issues that I mentioned. We also put in place a monitoring system that'll be in place for the next 3+ decades to make sure that whatever couldn't be fully remediated is managed and contained on the site. There's now 800 jobs here. When it was shut down as an Exxon plant, there were fewer than 100. So we put an 8x multiple on employment. There's 700 more people that have jobs in Edison, New Jersey than there were before. And this project, as a result of the real estate taxes that are generated from it, adds another $1.3 million to the town of Edison's income each year. Because it's industrial, it tends to not draw on services too much because you don't have families, you don't have kids, so they're not putting stress on the school system. So it's a much greater net add to the town than others. So even in industrial, which again is maybe a little bit less self-evident on how to show your agape, we can find a way to show love for people in this space. The last one I'll do, and this is more of a one-off. This is a little bit of a special one that we did a few years ago. This also happens to be also in New Jersey. This is in Florham Park, New Jersey. We owned a really, really big piece of land for a long, long time out in Florham Park that we eventually developed into a whole host of things. There's some office headquarters buildings. There's some hotel projects. We actually sold a piece of it to the New York Jets for their training facility. And we also did this project, which is called Independence Way. We donated the land for this project, which was about 8 acres. We invested our equity capital, really donated our equity capital because the project's not going to be sold. We partnered with the United Way of Florham Park. And in addition to the land and the money, we also put one of our best construction managers to help build this project. And today, in the 8 buildings, a couple of which you see here, there's over 100 adults with developmental and intellectual disabilities who live here independently every day. It's affordable, it's beautiful, it's in a great neighborhood, and it impacts their lives in a way that will transcend sort of my career and the careers of all the folks that worked on this. I'm super, super proud of this one. This one makes me really happy. And is, I think, one of the best ways as a company, certainly in the last few years, that we've lived into that principle of enhancing human well-being and showing our love for people. But there's also the idea of love for the city. Remember, that was the first guiding principle, love for people, love for the city. How do you show love for the city? This is where a lot of the fun part comes in for us, because we show our love for the city by creating beautiful places, creating amazing buildings that inform the streetscape, that enhance the fabric of the life at the street level, and that also inform the skyline in a way that helps the city be a beautiful place for decades to come. You see just a handful of things here. And when we get to work at this kind of scale with world-class architects to create places that aren't just beautiful when you zoom out and drive past it on the skyline, but also help invigorate, knit buildings and knit communities, knit public spaces into the fabric of the city, and create a better experience for the folks that live there, the folks that work there, and the folks that visit there. That's one way, through building great things, working with great architects, being thoughtful about what it is that we do from a physical form standpoint, from a materiality standpoint, from an engagement with the streetscape standpoint, that we show our love for the city. One real specific example on this that we're underway with right now, this is in Washington, D.C. Is anybody from Mid-Atlantic, D.C., Virginia, Maryland? Okay, great. So this is right in the downtown Washington, D.C. This is, if you know D.C. at all, this is catty corner to the basketball and hockey arena, and across the street from the National Building Museum. This, for the last 50 years, has been the headquarters of what's known as WMATA. It's basically the MTA for Washington, D.C. And it is what it is, right? It's a 50-year-old building. It probably looked really, really good 50 years ago, and it was pretty cutting edge, and it was really, a really nice addition to the city, but architecture can get old. It can start to look a little bit, and today, it was very dated. It didn't look great. The tenant that was inside, the WMATA agency, wanted to move. The streetscape was really not very good at all. It wasn't friendly. It was more of a barrier to interaction with people than it was an invitation for people to interact. We're now redeveloping this building. We didn't knock it down, but we're gonna do a pretty wholesale redevelopment, add some floors on the top, and when we're done, in about 2 years, it's gonna look like this. And I think it's gonna be one of the most beautiful buildings in DC. We're creating open space with some of the setbacks. We're creating an activated and engaged streetscape. And through working with a world-class architect, in this case, Picard Chilton out of New Haven, Connecticut, who are just amazing in the things that they're able to do, we're gonna show our love for the city of Washington, D.C. by replacing that old building with something that looks like this. So that's how we do it. What I'd like to do now is pivot a little bit, because that's a nice example, and it's sort of a benefit of having the job I've got, the experience I've got, the education that I have, that I can take this idea of enhancing human well-being and being a force for good and applying it very specifically, because I'm super lucky and super blessed to be running a company that works in this space. What I'd like to do with the rest of my time with you all this morning is talk a little bit about something where I think real estate development as an industry, I think the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate specifically here at the University of Notre Dame, and the university more broadly and some of the schools at the university might be able to be a force for good in the real estate development space. And that's around addressing a problem that I think folks are at least maybe hopefully aware of and understanding the issue around housing affordability. I think if you're from one of the big coastal markets in particular or high income areas, you'll know that this is a real problem. If you had an internship in New York last summer, you figured out firsthand about housing affordability in Manhattan is a real challenge. And it's something that's a well-documented challenge across the US. So let's talk a little bit about it and talk a little bit about how that might be an opportunity to be a force for good. So it's often, when we talk about housing affordability, it's usually looked at through the lens of like the New Yorks and the San Franciscos and the big coastal markets. But it's really a problem that's kind of endemic across the United States. Even in the most affordable states, you've got well over 40% of folks that are cost burdened. And cost burdened is kind of a technical term. It basically means you have to spend more than 30% of your income on rent. There's also a term sort of significantly or heavily cost burdened is you have to spend more than 50% of your income on rent. But you can see this isn't a local problem. This isn't a coastal problem. This is a problem across a lot of markets, and you see the markets that have had the most growth, if you've seen sort of, are aware of kind of what population and migration patterns have been, Texas, Georgia, Florida, Colorado, a lot of people have been going there in the last few years. Affordability has become a much bigger problem there than it was historically. And so it's everywhere, it's across the country, and it's basically getting worse. You know, historically, affordability issues around housing were mostly concentrated around the lowest incomes, or the group that's sort of on the farthest left on this chart. But as you see, in the last couple of decades, the issues of housing affordability have migrated up to different income bands that it never was a problem before. So it's not just geographically spread, it's demographically and income-based spread as well. So this is a problem that's been known for a while. What's being done about it today? Well, there's a number of different programs you see here, and these sort of rank from the highest, or sort of the lowest income programs to the more higher income programs. We have public housing, which is you're building the housing and giving it to people ostensibly for free. Section 8 vouchers, which is more of a place-based strategy or person-based strategy where you take the voucher and you can choose the place where you want to go, as opposed to public housing where you're being told where you can live. Low-income housing tax credits, which is a financing vehicle which is used to fund new development. That program's been around for a number of years. I think to date, they've built something on the order of 3 million units. And then inclusionary zoning for new development. This is a little bit of a technical thing, but in cities, a lot of big cities now, if you want to build a new high-rise multifamily project, either through a contribution to a fund or through a set-aside within the program of the building, you're going to help solve the affordability process. Inclusionary zoning means if you're going to build a 100-unit apartment, there's going to be a specific number, or a 100-unit apartment project, there'll be a specific number set aside for people that make under a certain amount of money. Usually it's 20. 80-20 is a lot of times you'll hear how this is an 80-20 project, so 20% are set aside for folks that make less money. And these are all good programs, and they're all focused at the biggest part of the problem, which is at the lowest portion of the income bandwidth. So typically between 80% of what's called AMI, or area median income. And just for reference point, when we talk about the United States, area median income is about $70,000 a year. And so these programs from public housing up through the inclusionary zoning are really focused primarily at folks who make less than 80% of AMI, which is where the bulk of the human beings are that are suffering from housing affordability. That's like where the problem is most acute. But there's also a significant population that isn't served by these programs. And this, I use the term here, the missing middle. These are folks who are in the 80 to 120 bandwidth or income band of area median income. And these are folks like, you think about, well, who falls into that band? These are a lot of what we called essential workers during COVID, the people that kept our cities running and our towns running. Firefighters, cops, police officers, nurses. There's about 24 million households that fall into that bandwidth. About a third of those are renters, and about a quarter of those fall into that rent burden category. So there's about 2 million households, or a little bit between 6 and 7 million people in those 2 million households that frankly make too much money for all the programs that have been established that I talked about on the last slide, but not enough money to afford typical new development, because new projects that Rockefeller Group and others like us do typically have to shoot at the highest rent levels to justify the economics of a new development, because the cost of the land and the cost of all the other inputs mean you have to get a certain level of income, and 80 to 120 AMI is not going to be enough money to afford the rents there. So why has that been such a problem, right? New development, it's really, there's a supply problem, right? If you zoom way out on the affordable housing thing, it's ultimately a supply problem, right? There's just not enough houses, and it's microeconomics, right? You got to build more stuff. If you build more things where the demand is there, the price should come down and the affordability should improve. So why has supply been a challenge? Well, let's talk a little bit about the development model, and we can sort of explain what this is. So for the folks that may not be sort of real estate focused or development focused, these are the big inputs when you're doing a development project to create something. You've got the land or the site. You've got what we call soft costs, and those are costs for things like permits, engineering studies, architecture fees, engineering fees, financing fees. It's mostly service-based things. The hard costs are the construction costs, or what your contractor is going to charge you to build the project. You've got financing costs because you're probably going to use debt. We usually use debt on our projects, and there's fees associated with that. There's an interest rate associated with that, and that goes into the cost of the project. And ultimately, you've got to have a profit component, which is another way of saying there's a cost of the equity. So for our business, we need to make a certain amount of profit on a given project for it to justify, right? We have a limited amount of capital. We have a lot of different opportunities. And so for us, typically, and I think a lot of real estate developers think about it in this way, Gross profit margin, you want to see something around 25%. I certainly know less than 20 to really make it worth your time. And I think when we look at development and where it's failed, there's lots of levers to pull here, and lots of levers that I think the university and the Fitzgerald Institute could potentially point their expertise at and their thought leadership at. If you think about soft costs, I think that the School of Architecture and the School of Engineering has a role to play here, right? Figuring out ways to build things less expensively, figuring out ways to build things more efficiently, figuring out designs that don't need to be bespoke every single time, that can be replicable, but still create great places. There's a design solution here that could really work, or that could really contribute to bringing the cost down. The hard costs, I know we have a new endowment on construction management. That's how are we going to build things. One of the biggest challenges real estate development has for the next decade or two is the aging of the construction labor force. And we're going to have to figure out how to build things differently in the future. And I think there's opportunities for both the engineering school and others to think about that. Financing is a business school question. Like, are there other ways, are there other creative ways to finance this outside of the established programs? Because the established programs typically are sponsored by governments or local municipalities and typically come with lots of conditions that start to take you away from the market-based solution. And the question I've got is, through working with the university and thinking about this solution and targeting this very specific missing middle 2 million families model, or 2 million families market segment, is there a more market-based solution? Because to deliver on this and to address the supply problem, if we can unleash the power of the market, unleash the power of private industry, that's a way to address this in, I think, a new way. Really look at this in a new light. What I want to do a deep dive with you all this morning about is the land piece of it, right? Because sometimes that's something that it starts with the land, right? And a lot of times, if you buy the land wrong, you're never going to make up for it on your project. It's sort of a fundamental real estate development truism. And I think the Fitzgerald Institute in particular, and the folks that are familiar with the Fitzgerald Institute, the Church Properties Initiative, I think could have a real role to play here in thinking about how the church can maybe help with this problem. Because I think there's an opportunity for private industry to partner with the church or other mission-based land developers to look at this problem in a new way, look at this missing middle affordability issue in a new way. And the main mechanism that I think is available to us is the idea of a ground lease. So let me tell you what that is real quickly. We'll do just a quick sort of ground lease 101. When you think about, these are two ways you can buy real estate. On the left, you see it's called fee simple, which is fee simple. I won't get into it, but it's basically everything that is encompassed within the piece of real estate. It's the land, it's the building, it's the air rights, it's the mineral rights, it's the whole ownership of the whole thing. Under a ground lease, you actually separate out the ownership of the building from the ownership of the land. So in a more sort of traditional development model, if one of you owns the land and I want to build a project on it, I'll negotiate with you for the price. We'll come to an agreement on the price. I will buy it from you. You'll get money. I'll get your land. I'll build it, and I own it, and I'll sell it in the future. Under a ground lease model, you retain ownership of the land, and I lease it from you for a long time. And these ground leases are typically 99 plus years. These have been around for a long, long time. So I'm going to lease it from you. I'm going to rent it from you for 99 years. I'm going to build whatever I want to build on it within the context of the agreement. I own the improvements, or I own the building, so I have ownership of that. I get all the economics out of that. You retain ownership of the land, and I just pay you rent on it each year. It brings down the cost because there's no upfront cost to buy the land. And it does, however, raise up the operating costs yearly because now I've got a lease payment that I've got to make that I wouldn't have made otherwise. So that's the idea. So that's what a ground lease is. You separate out the building from the land. And so I want to show you the power of that and how that can start to be part of the solution addressing the issue of affordability in the missing middle. And this is a real simplified example. I'm hopeful that you can see some of the numbers here. They may end up being a little bit small. So we're just going to walk through real quickly kind of a simplified example. So fee simple, you remember fee simple, I'm buying the land for you. So on this slide, I'm buying the land for about $22.5 million. You've got the soft costs, which we talked about, your design costs, your permitting costs. You've got your construction costs, your financing costs. LOC stands for letter of credit. This is taken from a different pro forma, a real pro forma from a real project, so there's a little more detail here. So the total project cost when I'm buying the land is about $131 million. Now I need to look at the income side. So I plugged in here for this project. This was actually done on a market-based project. I dialed the rents back to a more affordable level. So the rents with that wouldn't fit into that 80 to 120% AMI affordability band. You see your rents. You see VC is vacancy and collection losses. which is an operating loss. The expenses, the things that you got to pay to operate the building, real estate taxes, utilities, your staff costs. Ground lease payment 0 because there's no ground lease. So your NOI, or your net operating income on this, is about $7.8 million. So one of the things that we like to look at is something we call a development yield, which is your income over your cost. In this case, the development yield is 5.9%, sub 6%. It's not really exciting. That's not a really exciting development yield for a market-based developer. But the yield is interesting, but yield isn't how we get paid. We get paid on profit. So what do we think we could actually sell it for? Pricing it at an exit cap rate of 5%. For folks that are in finance, exit cap is basically an inverse PE multiple. So think of this, a 5 is basically a 20 PE multiple, which would get you to a sales price of $155 million. You got to pay some folks, so you put in your pocket $154 million or $154.8 million on your basis of 131, and we make $23.5 million. But that's only an 18% profit margin. And you heard me say a little while ago, 20 would be a thin deal for us. 25 is a lot closer to where we would want to be. So this is kind of this is part of the problem, right? The costs are what they are. You're targeting an income stream, so you fixed, or you're targeting an income level, I should say, and so you fixed the amount of rent you can get, and the numbers just haven't worked. And this has been the challenge for new development. Now, just playing around with the ground lease, so we're not going to change any of the other costs. This is what happens. So now, when we look at our costs, the ground is now 0 at acquisition. All the other costs are the same, but our cost has come down about 17% to $109 million. And we got to pay for that, though. So we still have the same income, still the same operating expenses, but we now have to pay the ground owner his lease payment or her lease payment every year for the next 99 years, and that's about $1 million, or $975,000. And that's priced off of, there's a mechanism you price it off what you think the value of the land is. In this case, it's between 4 and 5% of the land value, which is about right for a 99-ish year ground lease. Our yield on cost is a little bit better. We just popped it up by 40 basis points. Now we're talking. Now we're north of 6. North of 6 starts to get a little more interesting in today's capital markets. But again, it's tough to buy anything with yield. You actually have to have profit. Do the same mechanism on profit. We make $26 million, so we actually make a little more money. We're now in that bandwidth that starts to look pretty good for us. We're 24.5, and we've only moved one thing here. We've only moved the ground cost. We haven't changed the design cost down. We haven't figured out a way to squeeze efficiency out of the construction cost. I haven't changed any assumptions. This is all market rate financing. I think there's some opportunities in financing that are there. But just by looking at the ground lease, we've now created an opportunity to serve a constituency at 80 to 120 that wasn't there when we were buying the land. So that's why it works for the developer, right? So this looks great for me. I'm like, okay, let's go do this, right? This looks like a good idea. Let's go figure out how to make it work. But if we're going to partner with the church, or we're going to partner with mission-based landowners, it's got to work for them too. So why would a church or why would a mission-based landowner be interested in this? Well, there's a few reasons, and this is, I think, is sort of the interesting value proposition. So if you think about a church and think about a local parish, right? They have to more or less set their budget every year. They might have an endowment, but they usually don't. If they do, it's usually pretty small. So each year, the budget has to be created. The income stream is going to be based on pledges, and it's going to be based on weekly collections. By creating an income stream through the ground lease payment, you've now given that local parish or the archdiocese, however they want to share the money, an underwritable income stream that they can rely on for years to come. As opposed to a sale, which I've seen in the past, and I don't think the church is unique in this respect, as opposed to a land sale, a lot of times what happens if a church has an excess piece of real estate, say it's an old convent or say it's an old school that could be redeveloped, they'll sell it, they'll take the money, they'll have the one-time economic event, and they'll want to go what I would call as hard mission with that, sort of go to the most need in their community, whether it's a soup kitchen or a shelter or whatever. And I know our church is like this. I think a lot of churches are like this. Really good at starting programs, not always so great at maintaining programs as they go forward. What a ground lease payment, what this sort of underwritable, understandable, you can count on it every year income stream does, is allows the church to have income they can rely on to not just start programs, but maintain programs and create a little more flexibility in their annual budgeting. So a little bit of advantage there. It can also be a financing mechanism for a capital project. Because they've got this income stream, you can actually package that up and sell it. This happened, I don't know, have you done the St. Austin's case or talked about that at all? So if you're familiar, down in Austin, Texas, right outside of the University of Texas, a parish did this, and they executed a ground lease with a developer. They actually monetized the first, I think it was 20 or 30 years of the ground lease payments to fund a new project that they wanted to do. They actually got the best of both worlds. They got a payout today to start a new project, and then they got the long-run income to help maintain things as life goes on. It also allows the church to retain long-term ownership. And having some conversations with both local parishes, local churches, and other mission-based developers, many, many times when they look back at real estate decisions they've made where they made the decision to sell, they've regretted it. And this allows the church to maintain long-term ownership. These ground leases are long, right? They're 99 years. And for private industry or a real estate developer like Rockefeller Group, 99 years is a long time. Catholic Church has been around a little while, right? Like 99 years, basically like, we're good, we'll be there. We'll see you in 99 years. We have no doubt we're going to be there. And a little more subtly, it's an alternate way to serve their constituents or their congregation. Because the folks that are going to be living in these apartments are the same folks that are sitting in church on Sunday. And it's a way to serve them and enhance the market's ability to serve them in a way that they're not being served right now. So I think there's some real compelling reasons for them to do that. So the problem's there. There's an opportunity with this very specific market segment that's overlooked by the programs that exist today and overlooked by what the market's doing today. The old model doesn't work. And I think the real estate development industry, I think the University of Notre Dame, I think the Fitzgerald Institute, and I think maybe even some folks in this room could help take that old model, throw it away, and let's build a new model. Because one thing that we've seen over and over again is when the old model doesn't work, there's got to be a new model that does. And I do think there's a new model that works, and I think this place and this school, the Fitzgerald Institute, and our industry broadly can be integral in helping solve that. Because it is a problem we're solving. As we say in our guiding principles, it's work that's worth doing. It's agape in action, and it's really being a force for good in the real estate industry. So I know a lot of you are not going to be real estate developers, and that's totally okay. That's totally cool. And no matter what you wanted to be, whether you want to be an athlete, whether you want to be a lawyer, whether you want to be an astronaut, or if you want to be a dinosaur, no matter what it is you choose to do when you leave this place, if you can find a way to bring agape, to bring that love, that will for the good of another to your work each and every day, it's not just going to make you great at what you do, it's going to help you be the person that you were meant to be. But as with so many things, Father Ted says this way better than I do. He said this. The way he phrased it is there's no human event, there's no human progress in knowledge, science, or art that cannot be consecrated to a higher service, or that can't be a force for good. And I just add, even real estate development. Thanks so much. That's the remarks. Let's open it up to Q&A. Dan, thank you for letting me be here.
So thanks, Dan.
Great.
I'd encourage the students to jump in. I think we have a mic here.
I think I've got one. Oh, you got the mic for them. Sorry.
Just so everybody on Zoom can hear. So questions for Mr.
right.
Moore? Somebody's got to ask about
Yeah.
office. And a lot of questions.
Yeah, this doesn't have to be about the topic. If there's anything else we can talk about, I'm super happy to talk about anything. Please.
Hi, thank you so much. Sorry about that. You talked a little bit about the two different kinds of the business models that you do. You know, with the office buildings, you hold them versus merchant building.
Yep.
I'm curious what drives or motivates you. You know, the different approaches.
Yeah.
Especially, you know, you talked like with the building like industrial sites, you know, and with the worries about like the environment and so on. One thing I think about is, if you maintain ownership of it, you'd have more control over it and stuff like that. Not to say that, you know, not as a critique, I'm just curious,
Yeah,
you
sure.
know, what motivates these decisions and, you know, and even like the financial motivation behind it. You know, why, I mean, you could say it's not just not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Yep.
But, yeah.
So it's a great question. So the question is, so why do we hold some things long term, and why do we sell the things that we develop? And it's a really insightful question, because if you look at it from just the four corners of our business, just like there's a missing middle in this affordability that's not being addressed right now, there's a missing middle in our business, right? There's a sort of develop to hold that could potentially make sense. One thing I didn't talk about is when I talked about the history of the company. We're actually a wholly owned subsidiary today. We were originally owned by the Rockefeller family during the development of Rockefeller Center. But today we're a wholly owned subsidiary of a company called Mitsubishi Estate, which is one of the big three publicly traded companies on the Japanese stock exchange. And so we fit into a much, much bigger organization. So we're roughly, I think in any given year, we're somewhere between 6 and 9% of the business. And our role in the business is to create high IRRs, high returns, and high equity multiples. And we do that through the development business. Our development business, the reason we own, so you could say, well, why don't you just do development if that's the piece, because that's the role we play within the broader organization. The core portfolio, or the things that we hold long term, are the ballast income so that we can run that development business. Development as a business is very volatile. The cash flows are really, really chunky because you work on projects for a long, long time. There's a big event where the money gets made, and then it's not like a steady income stream. So by owning the 7 million square feet in Manhattan and the income that comes from that, we can kind of anchor the development business. We've got the steady state cash flow to run the business, keep the lights on, keep people paid, while we manage through the volatility of the development business. But the primary business is basically delivering the profit from the development business as a dividend to the parent company. So it's a good question, though. Thank you for that.
Dan, is that core under pressure because of the dynamics of the office market right now? Like your Manhattan core office, there's a lot of vacancy.
There is, yeah, and there's a bigger question. We can dive into that if people want to. What's happening in the office market, certainly in New York and broadly, is you're seeing a big divergence across the quality spectrum. Higher quality buildings that create compelling value propositions for tenants continue to do well, continue to find folks that want to lease space. What might be less distinguished or commodity office product is really suffering. So when you talk about, like, people say the vacancy in New York City is, I think it's like 18% right now. It's not 18% in every single building. The building where I work that we own, it's 0. There's other buildings where it's 80. Another building that we own, it's like 5. So the vacancy is not evenly distribution. It's heavily, heavily weighted to lower quality product and less well-located product.
Does it put pressure on rents, though? Sorry to interrupt.
Pressure on rents. It's funny, no, because you're not competing against. There's nobody like there. If you look at, for those that may know New York at all, there's a new project right by the train station called One Vanderbilt. Top of the market rents there, $200 a foot. Outrageous numbers, and they have multiple tenants who want to go there, and they tend to be small, and so we can talk about why that is. There's Class B stuff on 3rd Avenue that you couldn't rent to anybody for a third of that price. There's just no market there. So there are it's not a great rental market. We're having to do concessions and everything, so there is some pressure, but it's not the pressure you might intuit from some of the headlines that come out. So quality wins. That's one of the biggest lessons I got through my career is quality wins. In bad times, it helps minimize your downside, and in good times, it's where you can make some real profits.
Yeah. Is Rockefeller Group looking at all into office to residential conversions on Class B and Class C property in Manhattan?
Yeah, we are. So there's a lot of talk now because of the issues around office vacancy and some of those obsolete office products. As somebody said the other day, I thought this was pretty insightful. New York City, Manhattan is not necessarily overbuilt, but it is under-demolished. There's just a lot of stuff that shouldn't be there anymore that doesn't really have a functional use. And so the idea of can we convert those to residential, because as we talked about on the affordability, it's really a supply problem. It's a basic supply problem. It's super simple. And how do you make the economics work? So we are looking at that. It's much more complicated than you might immediately sort of assume, because what makes a good office building from the design of an office building, both how it's built, fundamental dimensions of, and I don't want to get too esoteric, but fundamental dimensions of how far like the elevator core is from the glass, how the water is distributed through the building, how the air is distributed from the building. Very, very different than what you need in an apartment, because an office building, everything's kind of in a central core and everything kind of sits there. In an apartment building, everybody wants to be able to control, your heat and everything within the 4 corners of your apartment. So the distribution of water, sewer, air, electricity is way, way different. You also have issues that the distance from the glass to the inside wall of the building or the core of the building for an office building can be much deeper than it would be for an apartment building. What you end up with some buildings, if you did the conversions, you end up with these like bowling alley apartments where the door, and it's like super narrow and super deep and there's very little glass, and that's not a really great apartment solution. There are smaller, older floor plates that have a different core to glass depth, can be a little bit better. But it's not nearly, everybody wants it to be like a quick fix, and it's far from a quick fix. But we are looking at it where we think it can make sense. Yeah, it's a good question.
This question is just more about your background.
Yeah.
I'm a mechanical engineering major, but I have some interest in maybe going into something more business related in the future. Mm-hmm. I was just wondering how your background helped you in your career and how you navigated pivoting from more of a pure engineering background to more of a business role.
Sure. So I think an engineering education, an undergraduate engineering degree is a real powerful tool in business, because I think it helps you think about problems in a very systematic way, I should say. You learn how to break things down. You learn how to think about really complicated things into steps. Your math skills are going to be really, really good. Chemical engineering is, that's no joke. So you've got some great quantitative skills that can certainly leverage in. I mean, the quant that you have to do in engineering would serve you really well in like the finance world. Like the math stretch is no stretch at all. Like it's a little bit simpler on the finance side. For me, the business school pivot was the big thing for me, right? Because I'd done the engineering thing, and then I was in the Air Force. And business school was the lever that I was able to use to pivot into it, because I really didn't even know about the business world. I'd never taken accounting, I'd never taken finance, and so that was how it worked for me. And then the military stuff has helped in a whole host of ways, particularly during the COVID experience, trying to lead a company through that. But I think, I think I mentioned this when I was here, graduating with a chemical engineering degree, you're not going to be a chemical engineer, but you're going to be a really good thinker, and that skill set can serve you across a whole host of different industries.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak with us again today. For those who are interested in breaking into real estate development, what are some intangible and tangible skills would you say are necessary for success in the sector?
Oh man. So if you want to, okay, so the question is, if you want to break into real estate development, you want to get into real estate development, you have got to have thick skin, I think, a little bit, because real estate development can sometimes be a conflict-oriented business. There's a lot of conflict that comes along, and I think finding a way to handle that in a productive way, in a way that's sort of true to your own values, is great. I mean, one of the biggest shocks I had was when I first got to Manhattan a number of years ago, and how much everybody yelled at each other in meetings, and how nobody listened to each other. And so being able to navigate conflict and being able to creatively solve conflict is good. I think real estate development, one of the reasons I like it so much is you get to be kind of the conductor of the orchestra, is the analogy that I've heard a lot of people use. And because you get to work on the front end with looking at sites, thinking about the realm of the possible, doing the underwriting, doing the financial analysis. There's negotiation with the landowner or with the mission-based owner if you're going to do a ground lease. You get to work with designers, and so you get to do all the fun sort of creative thinking about what might happen. You get to, once you start building things and you're on site, you get to walk the site. That's one of my most favorite things to do is walk a construction site and watch this thing start to manifest itself. There's the leasing, which is sort of a marketing and a business generation, and then there's ultimately the disposition, which you get to do negotiations and finance again. So you get to exercise a whole bunch of different muscles. And like the conductor of the orchestra, you don't necessarily have to be the best at any of those things. The conductor doesn't necessarily have to be the best cellist, right? But the conductor's got to know what a good cellist sounds like. And the conductor's got to know when the cellist is maybe not doing their best work, how to help encourage them to their best work. And so I'm not an architect, and I can't do what the architect does, but I can work with the architect. I can help explain what we're trying to accomplish and help them sort of exercise their talents to come up with a great solution. So I think a willingness to sort of be flexible and have an interest in sort of a broad array of things, good people skills really, really help, because it's a people-oriented business as well. And I think ultimately, when we're interviewing folks to join our shop, being able to effectively understand why it is you want to do it, because what I do find is the people who are most successful in real estate development have this visceral thing in their gut, kind of like the story I told, right? I went to that presentation, and it just resonated with me, right? It just hit something, and I said, this is what I want to do. And I think the more you're able to tie into that and be able to express that, because it's hard sometimes. It's really, really hard sometimes. And you want to be working in those hard times with people that are passionate, that are smart, that are high integrity. So understanding and being connected to why it is you want to do what you want to do. Because it's a great business. And it can be tremendously fun and tremendously, tremendously satisfying. So just a handful of suggestions.
Dan, can you take a minute to talk about your experience with land use, regulation, zoning, et cetera? Because we have a number of the undergraduates here are taken or will take real estate law.
Yeah.
And so fee simple. There's a number of law students in the room who have taken property law and maybe land use. And I think everybody, regardless of discipline, there'll be some intersection of that. So especially all the issues you talked about with supply on housing. What's the situation out there in New York? Obviously, is a thick, dense regulatory maze environment. So how does that play out?
Yeah, it's challenging. I mean, the issues around land use, and every place is different. Every place has. It's one of the things that also makes real estate really interesting. It's not a commodity business. Every place operates differently. Every place has different standards, and it's having great. One of the things is having great land use counsel helps a lot. Having folks who understand how an individual municipality would work, because they always have mechanisms for changing things or asking for exceptions or getting modifications. And I think understanding and being nimble and flexible and being open to all sorts of different solutions in land use is really important, because very often the place where we start and the idea that we've got will not be the one that we can kind of get approved and work through all that process. A lot of times there's community involvement, there's going to be concessions or give backs that the developer has to give as part of the negotiation with the town or the municipality. And so making sure that you're working in a collaborative way with the individual municipalities the best that you can while still maintaining the focus on what you're trying to do, and constantly sort of looking for solutions, because it's really easy to find all the ways you can't do it, right? That's part of it. Part of it is set up to sort of stop uses that they don't want, but figuring out ways to creatively approach the problem, working with your council, working with the municipality to expand maybe what the definition of the possible is or what the realm of the possible is. At the same time, the issue, I think we mentioned this earlier today, there was a program in New York, the 80-20 thing that I mentioned about the inclusionary zoning. There's a program in New York City, or New York State actually, called 421A. It's just the code that it's in. That was the catalyst for development, because it was the 80-20, and by putting the 20% affordability into your project, you got certain benefits from that. One of the biggest land use issues in New York right now is 421A sunset last year, and there's been no replacement. And as a result, what you've seen is, because the costs are what they are, without that program, without that subsidy to develop, new market rate development has basically stopped, right? If it didn't get in the 421A program before it sunset, it's more or less shut down. And so that's a real land use problem that the city of New York's got to get. But it's where you start with. I mean, when I talked about sort of the soup to nuts thing, you got to understand what the land is zoned for. You've got to understand what you can get. You got to understand what's possible to get, changed or not changed. It's a fundamental thing to get your arms around early on in any project.
I think we may have time for one or two quick ones.
Thanks so much. That was really great. I'm just curious, because obviously the development kind of thesis right now is facing a lot of headwinds, just because of
it is.
Everything. Increased finance costs, cap rates are probably expanding.
Yep.
And I'm just curious, obviously we have a lot of portfolio companies where they can do both, so they're kind of pivoting to acquisitions more than development, but the core of your business is development. So I'm just curious about how you're thinking about risk mitigation. Is this a time to lean in? There's walls of supply in lots of markets that I'm sure you guys are active in. So just curious, what are you doing right now? Are you leaning in? Are you waiting? How are you thinking about that risk mitigation?
Sure. I was, under the heading of leaning in or mitigating, we're leaning in. We actually think this is I was talking with my senior team about this earlier this week. When I think about the season that we're in as an organization, this is a planting season for us, because we are very fortunate that we have a very strong balance sheet, and through the core portfolio, we've got access to a significant amount of equity that we can control. So we've got capital and we've got conviction. We sort of like a lot of investors, because we think about what we do through an investing lens, there's certain themes that we really like, and we've got great conviction in them. Some of them have to do with the need for logistics space long term and what's driving that, whether it's sort of post-COVID buying patterns, continued, expansion of online, nearshoring, not sustainability, but sort of resilience in the supply chain. There's a long-term push on logistics. That's not going to change because of right now. Similarly, we see demographic trends, particularly in the Rocky Mountain West down into the South and into Texas, that we think are long-term macro trends, and we like to build places for people to live, and we go to the places where people are moving. Again, we've got a lot of conviction in that. We've leaned in because with capital and conviction, when the tide's kind of out and a lot of the money's out, there's some good projects out there, and there's some good, we've done a lot more co-GP deals this year, because there've been great developers who had great projects who are just stuck because of the environment that you described. We can come in, we can help partner with them, we can bring our balance sheet to bear, we can bring our lender relationships to bear, we can be the guarantor on the loans, we can get them better debt terms sometimes, because we've got like a dozen relationship lenders. And so we really, I think so far this year, we put like 3-year investment targets together, and so far in the last 12 months, which goes to the fourth quarter last year, we've invested something like 50% of what our 3-year target was this year, because we think this is a sowing time for us, and that 3 years from now, 4 years from now, as you start to monetize these or start to sell these, it's really going to pay off. But the macro is 100%. It's harder. It's a lot harder now. Debt's really expensive, really, really expensive. So you're going lower debt. You're going lower debt values. Higher costs, and cap rates are, Mark Gibson's going to be here. Ask him about cap rate. It's changing every week, like where they're going. But as we think, again, longer term and having conviction on things, and we've dialed back rent growth assumptions, we've dialed back next buyer assumptions, which affects our next pricing. So we've definitely adjusted our underwriting, but we still think we've found some really interesting opportunities that'll pay dividends. It's that whole being greedy when others are fearful. There's a lot of fear right now, and so we're trying to be intelligently greedy, but we're definitely leaning in. We think it's been a good time to be putting money to work that will be monetized in 36, 48, 60 months. Dan.
We have one more question, Dan, but I want to make a point and echo what Dan just said. They're leaning in when the economy is not going in an up direction. That takes foresight, leadership. You're not borrowing as much, you're putting more equity in, you're lowering your rent expectations. This is also where a developer isn't just for a force for good, but they're taking risk that in 3 years from now, when these buildings get delivered and the economy's on an upswing, they're allowing that to happen. They're allowing people to move into apartments because they built the new supply that others were fearful and didn't necessarily build. And so it takes a lot of intestinal fortitude to lean in and develop at this period of time. And I think that's what Dan and his team at Rockefeller Group do very well. And it's because they have a strong balance sheet and they have strong conviction on long macro trends. They're not just trying to time a cycle. They're in for the long term.
We've also got some great partners too. Just to put a fine point on what Mike just said. So for example, that DC project I showed where we did the swipe, the old building and the new building, right? Nobody wants to invest in office right now. Like in this country, in this hemisphere, nobody wants to touch office. But we were able to find capital because of our Japanese parent company. We found capital both on the debt and equity side from Japan who does want to come here. So when we deliver that building in 2025, we'll be the only new product that delivers in a 48-month window in a time where over 2 million square feet is going to roll in DC. But that's what it takes. When everybody wants to be in development and the money's going in, that's the hard time to be in. The time to make the most money is when nobody else can build. We can build this thing, and when it hits in 2025, we're going to be the only game in town. It's going to be a big success for us, I think. Sorry, one more question. I know we're tight on time, Dan.
Just going back to that conversion question of converting the offices.
Yeah.
You listed numerous problems that you're facing today. Going forward, would you say there's any changes in designs that would help mitigate some of those problems you're facing today? Say if we find ourselves in this situation again in the next 50 or 60 years from now.
So I don't know that you could convince somebody to design an office building today knowing they could convert it to residential down the road. That's sort of like preparing to fail, right? And you'd be spending a lot of money on an eventuality that you hope never happens, right? And you probably couldn't justify it on a cost basis. What I will say is going on, and there's a great firm in New York City called Gensler. They've actually created this amazing tool where you just think of it as like a big funnel. You just pour in all these bad office buildings or underperforming office buildings, and it goes through it and kicks out the ones that could be used for residential development. So I think it's less about changing designs now than it is about really being creative about what you can do with what you've got. Yeah, great.
Please join me in thanking Dan Moore.
Thank you guys so much. This is my pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.